Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the SNP's General Election Manifesto. I know it's a cliche, but this election is extremely important. We're not just picking our local MP, we're not just picking the next government, we're deciding the very future of our country. The UK's relationship with Europe and Scotland's right to determine its own future are on the ballot paper. And that's why it's so important that Scotland returns a strong team of SNP MPs to Westminster. Our message in this election is very simple. Let's escape Brexit. Rather than Boris saying, get Brexit done, we want to get Brexit ditched. We want to kick the Tories out of Downing Street and put Scotland's future into Scotland's hands. In every single constituency in Scotland, the SNP are either the incumbents or the challengers. We are a voice for every part of our country, from the vibrant, modern city of Glasgow, where we stand today, to our rural and island communities. Our candidates, and we have a fantastic team of candidates, are ready to take Scotland's voice to the heart of Westminster. And make no mistake, Scotland's votes could make an enormous difference in this election. Boris Johnson desperately wants a majority to impose Brexit on Scotland, and yet another Tory government that we didn't vote for. So if we want to deprive Boris Johnson of that majority, there's only one way to do it. Only the SNP can beat the Tories in Scotland. So let me introduce to you the woman who will lead us in that task, my friend, the leader of the Scottish National Party and the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the launch of the SNP Manifesto for the 2019 general election. Now, these events are becoming quite a regular feature, which must be quite puzzling for people here in Scotland. 5 years ago, during the independence referendum, the leaders of the No campaign, made up, of course, of the Westminster parties, promised that if we voted no, we would get stability. But since then, the Westminster parties have delivered not stability, but constant chaos and 3 UK general elections. The promise that if we said no to independence, Scotland would stay in the EU has been broken, and broken spectacularly. The promise that it was just a scare story to suggest that Boris Johnson could be Prime Minister has been broken, and the promise that Scotland would be treated as an equal partner in the United Kingdom has not just been broken, but completely shattered. The reality of Westminster control over Scotland is this: a right-wing Tory government Scotland did not vote for, a Prime Minister in Boris Johnson who is dangerous and unfit for office, Tory cuts to the Scottish budget, our National Health Service under threat from a Tory-Trump trade deal, a power grab on the Scottish Parliament, children forced into poverty, and a disastrous Brexit deal that will hit jobs, living standards and workers' rights. But there is worse to come, because unless Boris Johnson is stopped, this will just be the start. Brexit is nowhere near being done. The Tories have barely got going. They haven't even started trade talks yet. Because of Johnson's hardline position, there is every chance that the UK will leave the EU without a trade deal next year. That would be a catastrophe for jobs. And even if he somehow avoids that, his dream deal will be a nightmare for Scotland. It will take Scotland out of the single market, which is 8 times the size of the UK alone, and out of the customs union, the world's biggest trading bloc. Compared with EU membership, that could cut Scotland's national income by around £9 billion by the end of the next decade. That is equivalent to £1,600 for every person in Scotland. Environmental standards and workers' rights will be at risk. And as night follows day, the Tories will sell out Scotland's fishing industry. The SNP, Scotland's Remain party, backs a new UK-wide referendum on EU membership. Jeremy Corbyn, incredibly, says that he is neutral on the issue of leave or remain. That means he is neutral on job losses, cuts to living standards, and the erosion of our rights. And of course, he would be happy to sit back and see Scotland taken out of the EU, even if there is a majority for Remain in Scotland, but not in the UK as a whole. The truth is that Brexit will dominate Westminster politics for years and years to come. And Scotland will pay a heavy price for the Tories' Brexit obsession and for Labour's neutrality, or to give it its proper description, Labour's woeful lack of leadership. So this election really, really matters. The future of Scotland is on the line. The opportunities for this and for future generations are at stake. We must not let Brexit rob our children's future. That means the kind of country we want Scotland to be is on the ballot paper. And at the heart of it all, I ask people in Scotland to consider this simple but fundamental question before you cast your vote. Who should decide Scotland's future? The people who live here or Boris Johnson? A vote for the SNP on December the 12th is a vote to escape Brexit. It is a vote to put Scotland's future in Scotland's hands. And crucially, it is a vote to deprive Boris Johnson's Conservative Party of a majority. You know, in this election, the SNP is the challenger to the Tories in every single seat that they hold. So the reality is this: in Scotland, only a vote for the SNP can defeat the Tories. By voting SNP, we can lock the Tories out of office, but we can do that only by voting SNP on December the 12th. And after this election, there is every chance that the SNP will hold the balance of power at Westminster. Now, unlike the Liberal Democrats, we will never, ever help the Tories into government. But we will... But we will be prepared to talk to other parties about forming a progressive alliance. Now, those parties, of course, are already looking to the SNP and to Scotland for inspiration. Many of the policies being promised in this election are already being delivered in Scotland by the SNP. The SNP has already abolished university tuition fees. We've protected the NHS from creeping privatisation. The SNP has not only protected free personal care for the elderly, we have now extended it to all age groups in Scotland. We've introduced free prescriptions. We've set up a genuinely progressive tax system which helps low-paid and middle-income earners. We're setting up a national investment bank. We've kept the water industry firmly in public hands. And while the Tories have been cutting police numbers in England, we've increased the number of police officers by more than 1,000. We've massively outstripped the rest of the UK in social and council house building, and we're helping with the cost of living. The SNP right now is investing in a huge expansion of early learning and childcare for vulnerable 2-year-olds and all 3- and 4-year-olds. This will be introduced in full next year, saving families up to £4,500 per child per year. With limited powers, we've also established a social security system with dignity and fairness at its very heart. We're introducing a new £10 a week Scottish child payment for low-income households by the end of next year. That will lift 30,000 children out of poverty when it is fully implemented. So in government, the SNP is not just talking about transforming our country for the better. We are doing it every single day. This manifesto builds on that, and it sets out how the power, the experience and the values of the SNP can put Scotland's interests front and centre in a progressive alliance to lock the Tories out of government at Westminster. It includes a clear demand for an end to austerity and a 3-point proposal to increase Scotland's budget. Firstly, for our National Health Service. In government, we have shown our commitment in very difficult financial circumstances to the NHS. Despite Tory cuts since 2010, we've increased frontline health funding by 13% in real terms, with more to come. In Scotland, the SNP is spending £136 more per head on frontline health services than is the case in England. And this amounts to over £740 million more spending in Scotland compared to the UK. Now, of course, given our rural population, there should always be higher per capita spend in Scotland. However, if the next UK government raised health spending per head to the current Scottish level, it would not only substantially increase health investment in England, it would mean that by 2024-25, frontline investment in NHS Scotland would be £4 billion higher than it is today. Second, there must be a real end to austerity. The Tories, and let us never forget they did this with the help of the Liberal Democrats, have left the Scottish budget £1.5 billion lower in real terms than it was at the start of the decade. A potential UK government that wants our support must reverse that cut to our budget and ensure real terms growth thereafter. And thirdly, the UK must make right the cuts that Scotland has suffered. Over a decade of austerity, the cumulative price imposed in Scotland has been a massive £13.9 billion. That's how much investment in our communities and public services Scotland has lost. And of course, the cost in human terms has been worse. That must be made right. A party seeking our support must be prepared to set out how they will repair the damage of a decade of austerity and put back money that has been lost. Remember, when the Tory government last needed a handful of votes from the DUP, they bypassed the Barnett formula to find money for Northern Ireland, and in the process, they denied Scotland around £3 billion per year of investment. We say enough. It is time for Scotland to be treated fairly. In any post-election talks, the SNP will also demand that Scotland's NHS be protected from trade deals. We will introduce an NHS protection bill. This will guarantee that trade deals will not undermine the founding principles of the NHS, nor open it up to profit-driven exploitation. And as a double lock, it will stipulate that no trade deal could come into force without the consent of our Scottish Parliament. Be in no doubt whatsoever, a vote for the SNP in this election is a vote to stop the Tories selling off Scotland's National Health Service. SNP MPs will also demand an end to policies that are pushing people into poverty, debt and desperation. That means the two-child cap on tax credits and the associated rape clause must go. There must be an end to the punitive benefits sanctions regime, the benefits freeze and a halt to the misery of universal credit. We will also stand up for fairer pensions. We will protect the triple lock and demand justice for WASPy women. We must never ever forget that the social security system is an expression of values and of solidarity. It helps those who are working hard but who struggle to make ends meet. The SNP will not sit by and watch it torn apart. In government, with the powers we have already, the SNP has been helping parents and families with a special emphasis on those all-important early years. The baby box, for example, provides practical help, but it is also a symbol of our values and of the kind of country we are seeking to build. It demonstrates that, as a society, we value each and every child in Scotland. The current system of maternity leave fails that social justice test. It is unfair and it works against those on the lowest incomes. It also means that parents, mainly mothers, often lose out on pension provision. We want to change that. Emulating policies successfully introduced in Nordic countries and in particular Iceland, we will propose legislation to increase paid maternity and paternity leave and also increase shared parental leave by 12 weeks to 64 weeks. The additional weeks will be specifically for fathers to encourage an increase in paternal leave. That would support mothers returning to work, and it has been shown also to help fathers spend more time with their children after paternity leave has ended. Of course, with the powers of independence, we would have the ability to bring this into force. At Westminster, we will use our influence to press for these measures to be introduced. And this kind of policy is the hallmark of the SNP's approach to government. Practical action to improve people's lives as we build the fairer society we know is possible. On the climate emergency, the biggest moral issue that we face today, Scotland has the world's most ambitious emissions reduction targets already enshrined in law. We're already generating in Scotland 3/4 of our electricity from renewables. Using our influence, SNP MPs will demand that the UK matches Scotland's ambition, meets its Paris Climate Agreement responsibilities and sticks to future EU emissions standards. We will propose a green energy deal that will ensure green energy schemes get the long-term certainty needed to support investment. The UK Office for Budget Responsibility estimates that oil and gas revenues will be worth £8.5 billion over the 5 years to 2023-24. That revenue, the vast bulk of it, of course, from Scotland, should be put to work in building that transition to a greener, sustainable future. So we are proposing the ring-fencing of oil and gas receipts, creating a net zero fund to help pay for the energy transition through investment in areas such as renewable energy, electric vehicles and carbon capture, utilisation and storage. And because those communities that currently host the oil and gas industry cannot be left behind in the necessary transition away from fossil fuels. We will demand that 12% of the fund, at least £1 billion over 5 years, will go to a net zero industrial strategy to help diversify the economies of oil hubs like Aberdeen, Falkirk and Shetland. Now, Labour wants to impose an additional £11 billion windfall tax on Scotland's North Sea oil and gas industry, which kind of shows that for the Westminster parties, nothing ever really changes. Since the discovery of North Sea oil, the UK Treasury has pocketed more than £340 billion in revenues. While independent Norway has set up an investment fund which is now worth $1 trillion, Labour and Tory Westminster governments have left Scotland with nothing. They claim that Scotland is not good enough or rich enough to be independent. But when they need to balance the UK books, they always seem to find billions of pounds of Scottish resources to do that job for them. Well, let me suggest today a much better way. You know, it's been estimated that the renewal of the Trident nuclear weapons system could cost more than £200 billion. That is a colossal waste of money, and weapons of mass destruction are immoral. So a key SNP demand for our support will be the removal of Trident from Scotland and the saving of billions of pounds to be invested instead in our precious public services. Until such time as Scotland is independent, we will also seek more powers for the Scottish Parliament. In particular, we want to see devolution of drugs policy to help tackle what is a public health emergency. And we will press for the devolution of employment law so that the Scottish Parliament can protect workers' rights, increase the living wage and end the age discrimination of the statutory living wage. So let people be clear. A vote for the SNP in this election is a vote to reverse austerity and to protect our NHS. It is a vote for action on climate change, for a fairer country and for more powers for our Scottish Parliament. But in this election, as has happened so often in the past, Scotland is facing a democratic deficit. Brexit is just the latest, albeit very extreme example of that. You know, the Tories last won a general election in Scotland in 1955. In the last 60 years, there have been 16 UK general elections. The Tories in Scotland have not won a single one of these, not one. And yet, for 36 of those 60 years, Scotland has had to endure Tory governments that we did not vote for. That is a democratic outrage, and that must change. By voting SNP, we in Scotland can do our bit to get the Tories out of office, and we should. But as we have learned from bitter experience, as long as we are governed by Westminster, our future can be imposed upon us. It is time to take Scotland's future into Scotland's hands. Now, I think people are becoming increasingly sick of hearing Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson talking about not allowing the Scottish people to choose our own future. Well, I've got news for them. It's not up to you. And you know what? It's not up to me either. It is a decision for the people of Scotland and for the Scottish Parliament. The democratically elected Scottish Parliament has agreed that people in Scotland should be given a choice over their future. An unelected Tory Westminster government has no right to overturn that decision. So an SNP victory in this election would be a clear instruction from the people of Scotland to respect Scottish democracy. So in this election, we can vote SNP to send the strongest message to Westminster, to Boris Johnson, and to every Westminster politician. There must be no Westminster veto over the right of the people of Scotland to decide their own future. And the SNP's message to any Westminster party seeking our support is this: if you cannot support this most fundamental of democratic principles, then the SNP cannot and will not support you. Today, Scotland does stand at a crossroads. We are facing two futures. In one future, we will be governed by Boris Johnson and taken out of the EU against our will. We will be at the mercy of an increasingly right-wing Tory party that will let nothing get in the way of their extreme Brexit vision. The right-wingers who are now running the show want to abandon EU standards, they want to cut Scotland's share of UK government spending, and they have shown that they will trample all over devolution if it gets in the way of Brexit. People in Scotland have the right to consider an alternative future, one in which Scotland's future is in Scotland's hands, not in Boris Johnson's hands. A future with Scotland as an equal partner with our closest friends in the rest of the UK and with the European Union. In an independent Scotland, we will always get the governments we vote for. The NHS will always be protected from a Tory-Trump trade deal. Decisions about taxation and social security will be made by the Scottish Parliament. We will have a migration policy tailored to Scotland's needs. There could never be a rate clause or a bedroom tax forced on the people of Scotland against their will. Scotland is a country of extraordinary talent and resources. We are already one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We are rich in renewable energy. We have a world-class food and drink sector. Our tourism industry is booming. We're a world leader in the cutting-edge industries of the future. We have more top universities per head of our population than any other country in the world, bar one. So we can be confident that a better future for Scotland is possible. We don't have to put up with the Brexit mess and what Westminster chooses for us. We don't have to put up with Tory governments that we don't vote for. We have the power at this election to change all that. So to people across Scotland, wherever you are, whatever your background, wherever you've come from, and however you voted in the past, let's join together. Let's stand up for our right to choose a better future. At this election, I am asking you to vote SNP to escape Brexit. Vote SNP to lock Boris Johnson's Tories out of office. Vote SNP to take power into your own hands, the hands of the people of Scotland. Vote SNP so that together we can build a better country for this and for future generations. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I will now take some questions from our friends in the media. Brian Taylor.
First Minister, thanks very much indeed. As I recollect, you took a bit of convincing to go down the road of supporting a second Brexit referendum. In this manifesto, you're talking about revoking Brexit altogether by revoking Article 50. That's quite a transition, First Minister. Do you think that is a...
I would say, Brian, firstly, thank you for your question. It's not a transition. The SNP has previously said if we were faced with the prospect of a no-deal Brexit, if that was the only alternative to a straight revocation of Article 50, we would favour the revocation of Article 50. It was Joanna Cherry, who I think is here today, who was part of the court action that established that right of the UK to revoke Article 50 unilaterally, and the SNP laid amendments in the House of Commons at a previous stage of the Brexit process, arguing for that as an alternative to a no-deal Brexit. Now, as I say, we would prefer UK-wide for there to be an option for people to have their say again, but a no-deal Brexit would be so catastrophically damaging for Scotland that is not something we can countenance. And of course, and this is where I accept I'm in a different position perhaps to other leaders in this election. I am the leader of a party, the governing party, in a country that did not vote for Brexit. So in a sense, we would, if we were in that position, be delivering and honouring the vote of the people of Scotland in the Brexit referendum. Right, I've got Kieran.
You have said, is this on? Yes. You have said, First Minister, that you would support Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister in exchange for an independence referendum. The Chief Rabbi has suggested that if Jeremy Corbyn became Prime Minister, the soul of our nation would be at stake. That decision may well come down to you. You could help Jeremy Corbyn into number 10. You could stop Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister. Why would you go against the warning of the Chief Rabbi on behalf of the majority of British Jews in exchange for an independence referendum?
Well, look, can I say firstly, I deplore Jeremy Corbyn's lack of leadership on the issue of anti-Semitism, and I do not condone in any way, shape or form that failure on the part of him and of the Labour Party to eradicate that from their ranks. I've said before on more than one occasion that I don't get to choose the leaders of the UK parties. We're in a Westminster election. If there is a hung parliament and the SNP is in the position of holding the balance of power, we have to decide how best to exercise that influence on behalf of the people of Scotland, but also as far as we can on behalf of the interests of people across the UK, and that's what we will seek to do responsibly. We would not be signing any blank cheque to Jeremy Corbyn or to any leader of the Labour Party. You've mentioned the position on an independence referendum. I've set out a number of other issues on which we would want to and demand to see real progress in order for our support to be relied upon. But finally, I would say this to people who are worried, who are understandably worried about aspects, including the one you've mentioned, of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. If we are in this position, it's because Jeremy Corbyn in England has managed to get himself into a position of being able to potentially form a government. And the SNP has a job to do in those circumstances of making sure the right values, the right policies, the right priorities are to the fore. So in addition to all of the other things I've been speaking about, we would be very clear of our expectations to any party leader who wanted the support of the SNP to make clear its zero tolerance approach to anti-Semitism, to Islamophobia, to any form of prejudice and racism. And I think to those worried about Jeremy Corbyn, it should give a degree of reassurance that SNP MPs with the right values and the right approach on these issues are able to apply that pressure. But my intolerance and my condemnation of anti-Semitism and any form of racism could not be more emphatic or stronger. Sam.
Sam Coates, Sky News. First Minister, do you think that Jeremy Corbyn is perfect and how can you even think of being able to put him in number?
Look, on the answer to the first part of your question, I don't know Jeremy Corbyn personally well enough to answer that question, but I do say unequivocally, emphatically, that he has failed to get to grips with this problem and this issue within his party, and I deplore that and I condemn that unequivocally. But as I say, part of the reason I am a supporter of Scottish independence is that I would rather, as the leader of the SNP and as the First Minister of Scotland, I would rather Scotland wasn't in the position of having to choose between the devil and the deep blue sea for the Prime Minister of our country. And I make no bones about that. I could never support Boris Johnson as Prime Minister for a whole host of reasons. But on issues of racism and racist comments, he certainly has a charge sheet of his own to answer there. And I would expect any Prime Minister, any candidate for Prime Minister, to absolutely take on these issues centrally. And I say again, while I would far rather Scotland was independent, I would say to people, not just in Scotland, but across the UK, I can't decide the outcome of the election in England, but if Jeremy Corbyn's in a position and Labour are in a position of being able to form a minority government, then better to have the influence of the SNP in there, the decent SNP MPs that will make sure the right values are to the fore on the part of any government. Andy.
Thank you very much. Andy Bell, 5 News. So we've heard your views on Jeremy Corbyn, but you say Boris Johnson is unfit for office. Can you just first of all spell out for us why you think he's unfit? I mean, that's going a hell of a...
How long do you have?
It's going a long way beyond just saying I disagree with him. Spell out why he's unfit, and it could well be you're going to be dealing with him to try and get an independence referendum. Is it smart politics, dare I say, to start calling that man unfit when you might be dealing with him to try and get that second independence referendum?
Well, the question, can you spell out why Boris Johnson is unfit for office? I'm happy to do that. I'm just conscious, though, we don't have the let on this venue for the entirety of the day. So I may... So I may have to summarise if you permit me. Look, I've made reference already to some of the comments that Boris Johnson has made about Muslim women, about gay people, some of the way in which he casually insults and offends people for gratuitous reasons. The fact that since he took office, I think it has become clear that we cannot trust a single word that comes out of his mouth. He stood at a platform in Scotland yesterday launching the Tory Manifesto and told a direct lie about me. Now, that's a minor thing in the grand scheme of things, but it illustrates the fact that he cannot be trusted. He dodges scrutiny. I think, I don't know whether that's going to change for the rest of this campaign. And of course, he is absolutely set on taking Scotland out of the European Union against our will with the most damaging deal possible. So these are just some of the many reasons that I do believe Boris Johnson is unfit to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And on the second part of your question that, well, I might have to deal with him after the election. Well, firstly, I like to just be a straight talker on these things, whether he likes it or not. But the second point I'd make is this. In Scotland, we have the opportunity to vote in a way that deprives Boris Johnson of the majority he is seeking and to play our part in ensuring that he's not in a position to be calling the shots over Scotland's future after this election. I will say again what I said earlier on, in every single one of the 13 seats in Scotland that are held right now by Conservatives, the SNP is the main challenger. So the message to people, the length and breadth of Scotland, could not be clearer. If we want to stop Boris Johnson, vote SNP, because that is the only way for Scotland to do it. Peter?
First Minister, you've said that the choice between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn is a choice between the devil and the deep blue sea. What is it about Jeremy Corbyn that you see as more palatable in order for you to back him and put him into number 10?
It's not particularly anything about Jeremy Corbyn as an individual. I couldn't, be clearer. If Labour ever want to give me the chance to choose who leads them, I will not choose Jeremy Corbyn. I'm not sure who I would choose, but it would not be Jeremy. I'm not a fan of Jeremy Corbyn, but if you're asking me in terms of why Labour and not the Conservatives, it is a policy-based thing. I don't agree with all of Labour's policies, far from it, but I have more in common in terms of the social and economic outlook than I ever have done or ever will with an increasingly right-wing Conservative government. And of course, you only have to look at the Labour Party's UK manifesto to see that they have borrowed quite a lot from previous SNP manifestos. Free prescriptions, free tuition, free personal care, opposition to fracking, opposition to NHS car parking charges, keeping water in public hands, a national investment bank. I could go on and on and on and on. So, you know, it's SNP policy that he's promoting at this election largely, so there you go. Right. With my apologies to some of the print journalists up the back, this is where my eyesight gets a little bit strained. I think I am seeing Sev Carell there. Yeah.
Thank you, First Minister. Severn Carell at The Guardian. You say you're no fan of Jeremy Corbyn. Would you support any moves at Westminster within the Labour Party or elsewhere to replace Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader in order to have a post-election coalition with Labour?
Look, I don't choose the leader of the Labour Party. I've said if I did choose the leader of the Labour Party, I wouldn't choose Jeremy Corbyn. So that probably gives you the answer to the question. If Labour wanted to change its leader, but I wouldn't have any great objection to that. Well, I suppose I should caveat it with see who they wanted to change it to. But I'm not in charge of that decision, and you know that is just the fact of the matter. But I come back to the central point here. You know, we are part of a Westminster system right now. Scotland is part of a Westminster system. If we want to make sure that Scotland's interests are as protected as it's possible to have them in that Westminster system, and that is a deeply flawed system from that perspective, then the SNP has to be prepared to exercise its influence in that way. But I would far rather Scotland wasn't having to sit and just hope that we get the least worst option. That's how it always seems to Scotland in general elections. And that's one of the many reasons I support independence, so that we can get the governments we choose, not the ones that are foisted upon us. And then from that basis of equality, we can cooperate with our friends elsewhere in the UK, across Europe and the wider world. It seems to me that is a far better future for Scotland than continuing to be part of a broken Westminster system. My apologies, but it may be helpful to me and to you, actually, if the print journalists could stand up if they want to ask a question, so I could see you a bit more clearly.
Hello.
Not all at once, of course, but Katrine.
It's Katrine Bussey from the Press Association. I just wanted to ask First Minister if your party was being misleading to voters when you put out leaflets in East Dunbartonshire that a court ruled yesterday were inaccurate and potentially defamatory. Thank you.
No, obviously the lawyer who represented that campaign yesterday put forward the case. We, of course, respect the judgment of a court and will honour that judgment. But beyond that, in a more general sense, I would say this. Jo Swinson has a record that she needs to be prepared to defend, and it's not a good record. It's not a good record on austerity, on welfare, on fracking, on a whole host of other things, and she seems a bit sensitive when it's raised, but it's going to continue to be raised because she can't run away from it. Chris.
Hi, Chris Musson from the Scottish Sun. The manifesto puts an independence referendum next year front and centre, next year in particular, when there's perhaps no polling evidence to show a majority of Scots want an independence referendum next year. Are you risking here alienating anyone other than die-hard independence supporters?
No. There is increasing support for independence. There is increasing support for an independence referendum in the timescale that the SNP has been proposing. And I believe it is right to be straight with people and to say down one path that lies before us right now is a potentially catastrophic outcome for Scotland. Being taken out of the EU, being governed by Boris Johnson with all that comes with that. So I believe it is really important for Scotland to get the opportunity to choose a different future to that and to choose what, in my view, is a better future. But the point I would make to everybody in Scotland, to those who support independence, to those who don't support independence and who we still seek to persuade, and indeed to some who I know will never support independence, and to those who may still be undecided. The point here of unity, I think, is that it should be for people in Scotland to make that choice. So whatever Scotland's future is going to be, it should be for the people of Scotland to decide that. It should not be imposed upon us by Boris Johnson or the Westminster system. And if we don't take that future into our own hands, that's what's going to happen. We're going to have a future imposed upon us that is not one we want and is one that is going to do great damage to this and to future generations. So I think it is time to choose a better alternative to that. I think Kieran, is it?
Yeah, thank you, Kieran Andrews from The Times. First Minister, your manifesto has tens of billions of pounds as the price to be paid for Labour support or a progressive coalition, as you put it, for SNP support to put Labour into power. Can you please tell us what costings have been done to pay for this? Because there don't appear to be any in the manifesto itself.
Well, we'll give you figures on any of the policies that you want figures for, but let me be very clear about our position here. Other parties in this election, UK parties, are making commitments about increases in public spending. What we are doing as a party that may hold the balance of power is setting out what we would expect some of the priorities for investment that we would seek to have, and we set that out in our manifesto. Of course, we will scrutinise budget proposals that come forward and be guided by the principles that are absolutely at the core of this manifesto. Income tax, of course, is already devolved to Scotland, but the progressive approach we have taken to that would be the progressive approach we would expect to inform any tax changes that Westminster parties were proposing. We would seek a responsible but reasonable approach to borrowing and fiscal rules. We are proposing in here a much more rigorous approach to cracking down on tax evasion and tax avoidance, and of course we are putting forward proposals here that would lead to savings of substantial amounts of money, not renewing the Trident nuclear system, for example, and instead ensuring that that money can be spent on public services. So that is the position we are putting forward, and I think that is a reasonable position. We saw the Tories find money for the DUP after the last election. I think by voting SNP, people in Scotland can make sure that Scotland gets treated fairly after this election. Right, I think I've got time for a couple more. Tom? Oh, sorry, there's two Toms. I was going to Tom Peterkin first, and then I'll come to Tom Gordon.
Thank you very much. Tom Peterkin, Press and Journal. Can you categorically rule out SNP support for Jeremy Corbyn's oil and gas tax plans in any Westminster deal? I
am not attracted to that or in favour of that. The only caveat I'd put is I've not seen any detail of it, but it seems to me that that proposal would cost jobs in the northeast of Scotland in particular. I am absolutely committed to the transition away from fossil fuels. That transition is already underway in Scotland, but we've got to make sure that is done fairly. You know, I grew up in the west of Scotland when, you know, I still saw the legacy of previous industrial transformations when people were left behind, when there was not a fair transition, and we've got to make sure it's fair. I don't think, from what I've seen so far, that this proposal does that, and I believe what we are proposing in terms of the Net Zero Fund and the Net Zero Industrial Strategy is a far better way to proceed.
Hello there, First Minister. Tom Gordon from the Herald newspaper. On the timetable for independence, in 2014 you said the transition would take 18 months and it would all be wrapped up just in time for the next Holyrood election. And that way, of course, you controlled the numbers in Holyrood and you can get all your legislation through. Now, if you have a referendum next year, you very quickly butt up against the next Holyrood election, perhaps only 9 months away, when the Holyrood arithmetic might alter, and also the campaign would probably feature on a yes vote. Perhaps your opposition parties would try to offer a second referendum in that election period. So it gets quite tangled quite quickly. So can you give me an exact time frame you would expect to get independence done?
We'll set that out in advance of the independence referendum, and we'll set that out clearly, as we did in 2014 in the White Paper. As you said, we had an 18-month transition there in terms of the transfer of power to allow Scotland to become independent. There were certain matters that we said in the White Paper would take longer than that to complete the transition, but we will set that out fully. I mean, I suppose in short, your question that, you know, elections make life difficult. Well, yeah, elections have a tendency often to make life difficult for politicians, but I'm afraid they are a feature of our democracy, and it's for politicians to make sure that we respect that and we never ever shy away from people having a say on what it is we're putting forward for the future of our country. Okay, I think Andy.
Andy Phillip at the Daily Record. Your message on Brexit is very clear, but what do you say to the million Scots that voted leave?
Well, look, I have always said I respect the vote of people who voted leave. I think the reasons that drove many people to vote leave, and you know, obviously some of them were directly related to the European Union, some of them, and I'm saying this based on many conversations I've had with leave voters, were due to frustration around austerity in the direction that Westminster was taking our country. I think those issues have to be listened to and addressed. But I would say two more things. You know, I, as First Minister, I cannot ignore the fact that a very clear majority of people in Scotland voted to remain in the European Union. And I have a duty, I think, to reflect and represent that desire of people in Scotland not to be taken out of the European Union against our will. The second point I would make is that I have spoken to so many people who voted leave in the Brexit referendum. I'm not saying they've changed their mind on the basis on which they cast that vote, but they are as sick of the mess that Brexit has become as those who voted to remain in the EU, because nobody who voted leave expected it to descend into the chaos that it has done. That wasn't inevitable, and I have spoken to very many leave voters who, if they had the chance tomorrow, would probably vote differently to how they voted in 2016. But as First Minister, and indeed as leader of my party, I will always seek to listen to and to respect how different people voted. And the final point would be, whether people voted leave or remain in the Brexit vote, nobody expected it to become the mess it has. And also, that fundamental point is that we should not as a country be having our future decided for us. Whatever future we have as a country, it should be one that we come together and decide ourselves. Okay, I think with that, can I thank you all very much indeed for your attendance. To the candidates here, good luck on the campaign trail. I'll see you all out there very soon. Thank you very much.